Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Now we have reached the point where we would now talk about hadith. We've already seen that God's message, Islam, is based on two sources, the Quran and the Sunna. Both sources are equally authentic and reliable because of the fact that they both satisfy the criteria of ijma, unanimity on the one hand, and tawatur, uninterrupted continuity on the other. However, there is a third source which informs us about the life of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. It's a very natural source, but the manner it has emerged, it causes lots of challenges and lots of controversies when we begin to explore what exactly it is and how does it impact our understanding of Islam. So let's take a few topics on the question of hadith one by one in the hope that we are able to better understand what exactly is the role of this important piece of information. What is hadith? Hadith is actually a claim which says that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said something or did something or was present on some occasion where something happened. And this information of his statement, of his action, or of his presence, this claim is supported by a chain of narrators which is considered to be the proof of the fact that the claim is correct. In other words, what we call a hadith is comprised of two components: a text, which is a claim that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said such and such thing, and a chain of narrators called isnad. It has a number of names, starting from the scholar, the muhaddith, who is mentioning, claiming that a certain statement, for example, was made by the Prophet, and from him onwards, there are a number of people mentioned, from the scholar, the muhaddith, till the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. There could be 4 individuals, 5 individuals, 6 individuals. So, when a claim that the Prophet said something or did something is also supported by the proof of the claim, then this whole presentation comprising of both components, the text and the proof, the matan as it is called, and the isnad, this is what is technically called hadith. Where do we get hadith from? We get hadith from the books of hadith. There are a number of books of hadith that have emerged which contain, mention within their text, a large number of hadith, a large number of claims that the Prophet of Islam, may God's mercy be on him, said such and such thing or did such and such thing. Most of these books emerged in the 3rd century Hijrah. In other words, 200 years plus after the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, left this world. The more prominent scholars of hadith are the ones who are described as the people who presented their books that are called Sahih. The most prominent scholar of hadith is Bukhari, Imam Bukhari. Imam Bukhari was born, it's said, in the year 194 Hijrah. and he died in the year 256 Hijrah. So, if we imagine that his book was presented a little earlier than when he died, we can well imagine that it was somewhere in the middle of the 3rd century Hijrah, something like 250 years after the Prophet left this world. His book is considered to be the most reliable. Why? I'll let you know later. But very close in reliability is another book which was by Imam Muslim. It was presented by Imam Muslim, who was born in the year 202 Hijrah and he died in the year 264 Hijrah. So you can see that they were both contemporaries. The books of these two illustrious scholars put together are called Sahihain, the two most reliable books of Hadith. However, there are some other books of Hadith as well which enjoy a lot of respect and confidence as far as the reliability of their contents is concerned amongst Muslims, amongst the scholars of Muslims. One of these books is the one that was compiled by Daud, Imam Daud, who was born in 202 Hijrah and who died in 275 Hijrah. Yet another was compiled by Nasai, Imam Nasai, who was born in the year 214 Hijrah and he died in the year 303 Hijrah. Then there was another that was authored by Tirmizi, who was born in the year 209 Hijrah and he died in the year 279 Hijrah. And finally, there was another that was compiled by Ibn Majah, who was born in the year 209 Hijrah and who died in the year 274 Hijrah. These are 4 other books which, apart from the 2 Sahihain, are 6. In Arabic, if you were to say Sahih in plural, it would be Siha, and 6 is Sitta. So these 6 books put together are described as Siha Sitta, the 6 most reliable books of Hadith. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't any other books of Hadith. There are scores of other books of Hadith which emerged in the 3rd century Hijrah, a little later as well. 2 of them are more prominent. One of them is the book that was presented by Imam Malik, and the other was the one that was presented by Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Even though these 2 books did not get the privilege of being included in the Siha Sitta, they still have significance. I'll tell you why. Imam Malik presented his book Muwatta Imam Malik much earlier than all these other books of Hadith was presented. Imam Malik was born in the year 93 Hijrah, as against, let's say, 194 Hijrah of Imam Bukhari, so 100 years earlier. And he died in the year 179 Hijrah, much before Imam Bukhari was even born. His book, Muwatta Imam Malik, has lots of hadith and is also considered to be a very reliable book of hadith. Some experts actually go as far as to include Muwatta Imam Malik in the Siha Sitta. They take away Ibn Majah from the Siha Sitta and they include Muwatta Imam Malik. The famous Indian scholar Shah Waliullah had written an explanation of Muwatta Imam Malik, which obviously is an indication of the fact that it enjoys a lot of respect amongst the experts. However, despite its undeniable merits, despite the fact that it was authored, it was compiled something like, at least 80 years before any other notable book of hadith was presented, it still did not get the opportunity of finding a place amongst the Sihah Sitta, generally speaking, even though there are some exceptions of scholars who think that Imam Malik, Mawta Imam Malik, deserves to be there rather than Ibn Majah. However, the reason why most scholars did not think that Mawta Imam Malik should get that privilege, basically there are two reasons. One is that even though this book is a very reliable book simply because of the fact, other reasons too, but more importantly because it happens to be historically much closer in time to the times of the Prophet than any of the other books of hadith. It is technically not a book of hadith only. It's equally a book of fiqh. In Mawta Imam Malik, you would not only find ahadith mentioned in it, but you would also find the verdicts of Imam Malik, who was one of the four famous imams of fiqh of the Sunni school of thought amongst Muslims. So, unlike in the case of other books of hadith, you would find that in Mawta Imam Malik, you have ahadith mentioned as well as verdicts, fatawa of Imam Malik mentioned as well, which makes the book not technically a completely genuine book of hadith. It's a mix of both. The other reason why Mawta Imam Malik doesn't enjoy the same status as the other 6 books of Sihah Sitta is that because the science of hadith had not reached a situation, a stage where the presentation of hadith was done quite as neatly, as critically in a sound way as it was done later. You find in Mawta Imam Malik some ahadith which are presented in a way that Imam Malik is claiming that he heard this hadith from somebody who was reliable, whom Imam Malik found to be a reliable person. Now, obviously Imam Malik was an outstanding scholar, one of the very few scholars who could be picked as the most significant and outstanding scholars of Islam of all times. Yet, when you look at the understanding of hadith and the science of hadith, the way it developed in the 3rd century Hijrah, it really is a flaw that you're not mentioning a narrator, probably the most significant narrator who is the closest to the one who is claiming that this is a hadith. So, Mawta Imam Malik was not given the position of a book of hadith like some of the other important books were given by experts. The other book of hadith that I have chosen to mention, apart from the Sihah Sitta books, the 6 books, is the book by Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. It is called Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal. This book is significant for 2 reasons. One reason is that it's the most voluminous of all books of hadith, well-known books of hadith. If let's say roughly Imam Bukhari has something like 7,000 hadith, Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal has roughly 27,000 ahadith. So we have almost roughly 4 times as many ahadith in Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal compared to what we have in the book of Imam Bukhari, the Sahih Bukhari. Therefore, there are some people who say that if you were to have an idea of what hadith is, whatever there is in the literature of hadith, it would suffice for a scholar to just go through Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and if somebody who has gone from cover to cover of all the volumes of Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he or she has as if read all ahadith that are available. The other significance of Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal is that it's a book which is musnad. It's a book that has been arranged in a different way. Most of the books of hadith have been arranged, categorized in different topics. So you would find typically Kitabul Iman, the book of faith, Kitabul Salat, the book of prayer, Kitabul Tahara, the book of purity, purification, etc. Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, on the other hand, has arranged the ahadith under the category of the companions of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. So if somebody was to know, for example, as to what are the ahadith that have been narrated by Abu Huraira, may God be pleased with him, or Aisha, may the Almighty be pleased with her, etc. The book to look at is Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal. All right, now let's move on. How do we scrutinize hadith? In other words, how could somebody feel confident that a certain hadith that we are going through is actually a reliable one? What are the chances that that's what the Prophet might have said or done? What's the probability? Well, there are two criteria that the scholars have normally resorted to in order to come to a conclusion as to whether to rely upon a particular hadith or not. One of the two criteria is the criterion of Rev Ayat, and the other criterion is the criterion of Darayat. In the criterion of Rev Ayat, what happens is that a scholar would look at the names of the narrators who were responsible for transmitting the message from the Prophet to the scholar who compiled the book. Obviously, the compiler of the book of Hadith, Imam Bukhari, for instance, did not meet Prophet Muhammad, may God's mercy be on him, himself. There is a gap of more than 200 years. So he met somebody, let's say A, and A in turn had met B, who belonged to the earlier generation. B had met C, C had met D, and let's say D met one of the companions, let's say Abu Huraira, who met the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, and he said, that's what I heard the Prophet saying. Now, when you are scrutinizing a hadith from the point of view of ayat, then the expert is trying to look at the names of these narrators, A, B, C, D, E, whoever they are, and would form an opinion about their reliability. Now, what criteria are looked at? How far was the individual morally upright? How good was his memory? How much was he affiliated with religion? What is the possibility that the two narrators coming together in the chain, A and B or B or C, what are the chances that they could have met each other? And so on. So, when a muhaddith, when an expert finds himself comfortable that all these narrators were reliable, and there seems to be a very good chance that they would have met each other, the ones who were next to each other in the chain. They would give their verdict that in their opinion, from the point of view of the riwayat, the criterion of Rev Ayat, the narration, the text seems to be okay. This, list of people, the names, they call the names Asma al-Rijal, the names of hundreds and thousands of people are there in the books of these experts, those who have chosen to focus their attention on, to specialize in forming opinions about this large number of people who in the first, second, third and fourth centuries, generations of Muslims, they were responsible in transmitting information about the Prophet from one generation to the other. So this large body of information which actually talks about the possibility of these people being reliable or not, this is what causes experts to come to conclusion whether a certain hadith is reliable or not. So that's one criterion, the criterion of Rev Ayat. Imam Bukhari's book is the most popular book because it is said that his criterion or criteria for accepting a certain person as reliable for the purpose of taking hadith from him comfortably, his criteria were the most stringent, very strict, and he applied them as strictly as could be possible. Not very far behind was Imam Muslim, and the others were also relatively strict about these criteria. So that's one criterion, the criterion of Rev Ayat. The other criterion is the criterion of Darayat, which really is, instead of looking at the chain of narrators, the criterion of Darayat looks at the statement itself, the text, and it looks at the possibility as to whether what is mentioned in the text is what the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, could have said. In other words, the text is looked at and the scholar forms an opinion as to whether the statement that is attributed to the Prophet could actually have been made by the Prophet. So, for example, they look at the fact as to whether it's consistent with the Quran, or at least it doesn't conflict with the Quran. Whether the statement is or is not in conflict with Sunna. Whether the statement is or is not in conflict with other ahadith. They also look at the fact as to whether what is mentioned in hadith is conflicting with the common sense or not. So, all these factors are looked into when the criterion of darayat is applied. And if a certain statement which is attributed to the Prophet doesn't seem to be consistent with any of these criteria, the expert would say that this particular narration, this particular piece of information doesn't seem to be acceptable. So in other words, experts of hadith, the Muslim scholars, they have applied these two criteria of riwayat and darayat to a greater or to a lesser degree. And not surprisingly, therefore, what we find is that there are differences of opinion regarding the acceptability or otherwise of a certain hadith. Some experts would say that it's absolutely fine. Others would say that we have our very strong reservations, either because there is some problem in the criterion of riwayat, or there is some problem that we've found while applying the criteria of darayat. Now let's move on. What exactly are the religious contents of hadith? When I say religious contents, what I mean is that most certainly hadith says quite a few things that have got nothing to do with religion. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, had his own private life. He had his own tastes. There are so many things that are mentioned about him and his times that it got to do with, the particular era that he was living in, the particular place, environment that he was a part of. However, there are a lot of information in the books of Hadith which are relevant to religion. If we categorize all the data information in Hadith that applies to religion, probably it wouldn't be an unfair conclusion to draw that there are 3 different categories to which Hadith would belong to if its contents are religious in nature. One category could be that it's fiqhun nabi. It's the fiqh of the Prophet, given by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. The other category is that it could belong to ilmun nabi, that knowledge given by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. And the third possibility is that it could belong to the category of Siratun Nabi, the glorious example of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. Now let's look at Fiqhun Nabi. Fiqh means understanding. This word has been used in the Quran, but when we use this word as a technical term in religion, you know that there's a very important branch of Islamic learning which is called fiqh, normally described as fiqh, jurisprudence. Fiqh emerges from the fact, this whole body of knowledge, it emerges from the fact that even though it's true that Islam has been mentioned in the Quran, it's there in Sunna. We find that there is mention of God's religion in Hadith. However, we still have to understand the Quran, the Sunnah and Hadith. And at times, there are questions which are not clearly or directly answered by these sources. At times, there are mentioned statements which are apparently incomplete. There is some part that has been left not described explicitly because the information is implied. So, in other words, in order to understand the Quran, the Sunnah and Hadith, we need to have scholars who would form their opinion and tell us as to whether this statement means this thing or that thing. Now, this understanding of fiqh, the understanding of the sources of Islamic learning, this understanding is to be found within the Quran as well. The Quran explains its own meanings in more detail. This job has been done by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him as well. That would be, whenever it's done in Hadith, whenever it's done and it was mentioned in Hadith, that part of Hadith would be described as Fiqhun Nabi. The explanation, the clarification made by the Prophet regarding a certain statement of the Quran, for example. Let me give you an example. The Quran mentions on more than one occasions a principle. Laysa lil insani illa ma sa. Man is not going to get anything except for what he himself strives for or strove for. In other words, you will get in the hereafter what you did yourself. You're not going to get what others would do for you. So each individual is independent and is actually creating his own destiny for the future, so to say. Now, this is the principle that has been mentioned in the Quran. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, mentioned something which explained this principle still further. He said when a person dies, his book of account, his book in which his deeds are written, are closed, except for three things, three possibilities. One, if he had completed some project of welfare, which even after his death is helping out other people, like a hospital or an orphanage or a library or something else, which he created or was instrumental in creating during his lifetime, but even after his death, the project is helping out others. So that help that it is giving to others is going to benefit the deceased as well. Now this is consistent with the basic principle that man doesn't get or will not get anything except for what he strove for. The second thing that the Prophet mentioned is knowledge, which continues to benefit people even later. And the third category is his children whom he trained, and they pray for him even after his lifetime. This is actually an explanation of what the Quranic principle said, but it has been extrapolated and has been applied to areas which were there implied in the statement, but what would not have been understood by the common man had the hadith not been there. The second category is ilmun nabi. By ilmun nabi, one means that knowledge which was given to us by the Prophet, but it's not there in the Quran. It's over and above the Quran. One example of it would be the information about the arrival of Dajjal. There would be somebody who would come to this world and would claim to be the Messiah, Jesus Christ, even though he would not be Jesus Christ. So, Al-Masihud Dajjal, the great deceiver. A third category of the knowledge that we get from hadith that is directly relevant to religion is what we can describe as Siratun Nabi, the glorious example of the Prophet. His character, the manner he went about to practice religion, that's what we find in hadith aplenty. And probably that's the most important part of hadith. We don't have any other source except hadith which tell us the glorious example of the Prophet. So all these three categories are the ones that are directly relevant to religion. Hadith, as I said, is a very important but a very challenging area of Islamic learning. There are a few difficulties that one confronts while understanding hadith on certain occasions. One of them is the possible conflict with the Quran. Hadith, if it's correct, can never be inconsistent with the Quran. Quran is the word of God. How could the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, ever say anything, do anything against the Quran? He was the one who brought the Quran. He was the one who was the model of the Quranic principles. However, at times one could find that there is an apparent mention in hadith which goes against the Quran. For example, it's mentioned in a hadith that Aisha radiyallahu anha, may God be pleased with her, was approached by a companion who said about a fellow companion that he claims that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said that when a person dies and there are women who are crying and wailing on his death, because of the hue and cry they raise, the deceased person is pained. He is in difficulty. Aisha, the scholar of Islam and the Quran, immediately responded by saying, how could it be possible? Because the Quran says, La taziru waziratun wizra ukhra. no soul shall bear the burden of another soul. How could it be that there are women who are crying and the person who died, he is getting punished because of them crying? In other words, the Quranic text, according to the wife of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, did not accept the statement that was attributed to the Prophet, and she went on to clarify that in actual fact what had happened was that there was a Jew who had died and whose funeral procession was taking place. He was being taken to the graveyard, and there were women in the house who were crying, and the Prophet said that while they are crying, he is getting punished. The two were not linked with each other in the prophetic statement, but the narrator somehow put them together as if one was leading to the other. So that's one example where things can go wrong, that a statement is made in the hadith which claims to be from the Prophet, but in actual fact it goes against the Quran, and the real statement was something different. The second problem could be conflict among companions. Sometimes the same statement, the same incident is reported by more than one companions, and what you find is that even though the incident is the same, there are different versions of it, one of which can only be true and not all of them. One such example is the famous hadith which is talking about the fact that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was visited by the angel Jibreel alayhi salam in the human form. That was something towards the very end of the prophetic mission, and the angel Jibreel asked the Prophet a few questions. He asked him about what Islam was, what was Iman, faith, what was Ihsan, achieving the level of excellence in Islam. He asked him about the Day of Judgment as to when it's going to arrive. And the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, replied that the one who is asking and the one whom the question has been posed, neither of them knows about it. And then he asked about some of the signs of the Day of Judgment, of the times when this worldly life is going to be close to the Day of Judgment. However, this particular narrative has found its place in the books of Hadith through two different companions, Umar radiallahu anhu and Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. While almost the entire incident has been narrated by both ahadith, coming from both sources, in almost the very same manner, with slight difference of wordings. However, there is one significant difference, that when this question was posed to the Prophet as to when is the life hereafter going to come, what's going to be the time, he mentioned that neither he knew anything about it nor the one who was asking the question, in other words, Jibreel alayhi salam. However, in the narrative of Abu Hurairah, there is another statement which says that this information as to when this life is going to come to an end, this is one of those 5 areas, pieces of information about which nobody knows except God. And then he recited the very last verse of Surah Luqman, the 31st Surah of the Quran. Umar radiallahu anhu doesn't mention it at all. What is the significance of it is something that I'll talk about later in one of the later lectures when I'll talk about belief in prophets. But what you find is that the same incident, but there are some parts of it where the two descriptions are different. Another problem in hadith that one comes across sometimes is that there is no clear mention of the context. And when the context is not properly mentioned, what you see is that, what was meant to be communicated, the message gets very different. For example, in the book of Hadith of Bukhari, as I said, the most reliable book of Hadith, you find in one chapter a mention that the Prophet is reported to have said that the one whose trousers are lowered to cover the ankles and go beneath them, the part of the ankles that are covered shall burn in fire. Obviously, it's a very serious statement. And it is on the basis of this statement that we find that there are many Muslim men who make sure that their ankles do not get covered by whatever lower garment they are wearing. But what has happened in this hadith is that when you move further in the same chapter, where other hadith narratives are mentioned, you find a similar hadith mention with a little addition. It says that the Prophet said, may God's mercy be on him, that the one who lowers his lower garment to cover the ankles and goes beyond, out of arrogance, that part of the ankles and the lower part of feet are going to burn in fire. Now, obviously, the understanding changes completely. In the first narrative, which was a complete hadith, it was a complete statement that can be described as hadith, it mentioned it without any reference to arrogance. It was as if whoever does it is going to find himself, or at least some part of himself, burning in fire. But in the next narrative, a little later, it clarifies that if somebody does it out of arrogance. Quite obviously, the first narrative was mentioned by somebody who missed talking about arrogance. And the impression that it creates is that as if it's a complete statement made by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. You go further in that chapter and you find another hadith which says that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu asked the Prophet, he informed him that my lower garment, it cannot be controlled, it just goes down lower than the ankles. It just slips. The Prophet said, it's not for you. It's not something that is applicable to you. It was meant for those people who do it out of arrogance. So what happens is that at times what you find is that a statement is made, apparently it seems to be emerging from the Prophet, and yet the statement is not properly telling the context and the complete picture. All right. Now, how is hadith different from sunnah? Quite often we find Muslims, they're talking about sunnah and hadith in the same breath. In actual fact, there are many Muslims who believe that they mean one and the same thing. They use hadith and sunnah interchangeably, synonymously. The fact of the matter is that hadith is different from sunnah in some very important ways. Number one, when it comes to the question of sunnah, there's complete unanimity amongst Muslims, right from day one. All companions of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, they unanimously accepted sunnah. They all prayed 5 times a day. They all did hajj, fasted. Those who had adequate enough wealth, they paid zakat. Others who didn't knew that zakat was there. And so on and so forth. The Eid prayer, the Jummah prayer, the funeral prayer, etc. All those religious practices were not just known to all companions. The fact is that they all practiced them. Hadith is a statement or a practice which was heard, observed by some, not all, some people, some companions, and those some companions then transmitted that piece of information to other people in the next generation and so on. So, there is neither any unanimity, no complete agreement. In fact, one can say with full confidence that almost all ahadith in the book of hadith are those which the Prophet mentioned, and some of the companions were there and others were not there. So, how could there be a unanimity? How could there be a consensus? The other difference between Sunnah and Hadith is that there is tawatur, uninterrupted continuity in consensus in Sunnah, which obviously is not there in Hadith. I mean, all companions, they prayed 5 times a day, and the next generation prayed, all of them, and then the next generation. So it has, gotten transferred from one generation to the other and the next one. So there is no gap. In the case of Hadith, we find a gap of at least 2 centuries, wherein the books of Hadith were not there. Even if they were there, they were very limited. Not all Muslims all over the world knew that there are ahadith, which everybody knows. Some knew some, others knew others. And so this information which was there, but was not available to all in the first 2 centuries. What it means, in the first 4 generations of Muslims, by far the very best generations from a religious point of view, and yet they were not quite as well aware of hadith as the later generations were. So there is no tawatur. And the third difference is that in the case of hadith, you've got all sorts of information. Information which is relevant to religion, information which is not relevant to religion, information about the personal life of the Prophet, about the events that took place, and so on and so forth. Sunnah, on the contrary, are definite religious practices. Because, as mentioned earlier, the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, as indeed all other prophets, came to deliver religion. So, there are many differences between Sunnah and Hadith. What is the attitude of Muslims towards Hadith? Well, one can well imagine that the attitude of Muslims towards Hadith varies. Lots of different attitudes. One attitude towards Hadith, which I would say that the vast majority of the Muslims follow, is that so long as a Hadith qualifies to be described as Sahih, if the scholars of Hadith like Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, etc., they feel comfortable that a Hadith is reliable from the point of view of the reliability of the narrators, then it has to be accepted, it has to be taken as valid, applicable from a religious point of view. So, one attitude towards Hadith is that all Sahih Ahadith have got to be accepted as very much a part of God's religion, and that's where we should get our religion from, because who can understand and practice God's religion more than and better than the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him? So the attitude is that if you've got a Sahih Hadith, well, that's what is religion, we should accept it and we should follow it. The second attitude towards Hadith is the attitude of the Quranists. They don't accept it. They simply refuse to accept any source of knowledge for the purpose of understanding Islam outside the Quran. So they would neither accept Sunnah nor would they accept Hadith. That's what the second point of view is, which is, as you can see, just the opposite of the first point of view. The third point of view is the midway point of view, according to which Hadith is to be taken seriously if it comes from a source which is reliable, but it has to be understood in the light of the two original sources of the Quran and Sunnah. According to this understanding, the midway approach, Hadith cannot add anything to the content of religion. What has already been mentioned in the Quran and what's already there in Sunnah and what's already there in human nature, which is even before the Quran and Sunnah, nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken away from it because of some mention in Hadith. However, Hadith would explain the Quran, explain the Sunnah, explain human nature. It could either explain and do shara or could mention its implications, corollaries, fara. In other words, the Quran and Sunnah and human nature as well, they are the basic sources of religion. However, at times, a common person, an ordinary person, may not be able to understand the deeper implications of some statements of the Quran, some practices of the Sunnah, and some implications of human nature. Hadith, because it's the knowledge coming from the Prophet, would help in getting the understanding of these sources explained, applied to such areas of life which ordinary humans would not have been able to apply. So it's either the explanation or the description of the implications of Quran, Sunnah and human nature which you find in Hadith. So according to this point of view, Hadith is actually a footnote of the Quran and Sunnah. If there is an apparent conflict between the Quran, Sunnah and Hadith, it is the Hadith which has to be adjusted with the Quran and Sunnah and not the other way around. To give you an example, we find in the mention of Hadith apparently that the pictures of living beings are condemned. They are undesirable, they are condemnable. There is no such mention in the Quran. There is no such mention in Sunnah. Sunnahs are practices, so there couldn't be any mention there. In actual fact, what we find in the Quran is that in Surah Saba, which is the 34th chapter of the Quran, it's verse 13, where we are informed that Sulaiman alayhi salam, King Solomon, one of the prophets of God, in his palace, there were tamathil, there were statues, obviously of living beings. Now, imagine in the first 2 centuries of the Muslim history, a vast majority of Muslims who didn't even know that there were a hadith condemning the pictures of living beings, they would read that, there were statues that were there in the palace, in the residence of one of the prophets. So why would they ever feel that there is anything wrong with the pictures of living beings? Therefore, what seems to be the correct understanding, if this hadith and such ahadith are looked at in the light of the Quran, they actually mean that any picture, any statue, etc., which is an object of ascribing partners to God, polytheism, which is employed and used for the purpose of seeking somebody else's attention and help other than God, That's what is haram. If there is any picture, any statue which is obscene, vulgar, that's haram. If there is any statue, any picture which is used for promoting something immoral, that would be condemnable. Not all pictures, all statues. So, according to this point of view, all ahadith, the entire body of hadith literature, must undergo this process of scrutiny, whereby whatever is mentioned, if it has any religious significance, it ought to be seen in the light of the Quran and Sunna and to be placed as the footnote of these two sources. May the Almighty enable us to understand His religion and the sources of His religion properly, and may He enable us to practice His religion as best as we can.